Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well tonight, because the story I'm about to tell is one of those that never truly end. It echoes through steel and water and memory, and once you hear it, you'll never forget it. It begins not in the roar of battle, but in a quiet office thousands of miles away, where a single man stared at a map and refused to wait any longer. His name was Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Navy, a man as impatient as he was determined. In June of 1942, the victory at Midway had filled newspapers with triumph. Yet deep inside King's mind, there was only restlessness. He knew Japan had been hurt, but not broken. He knew the ocean still belonged to the Empire's warships that moved like silent predators beneath the clouds. Each morning, he would look at reports stacked on his desk, columns of tonnage sunk, air crews lost, ships damaged, and feel the weight of every entry pressing against his ribs. Midway was not enough. It was only the start. And he wanted more. He wanted the war to move forward, to strike back, to erase the humiliation that had begun at Pearl Harbor. The memory of that burning harbor still lived behind his eyelids, the oil fires, the twisted hulls, the faces of men pulled from blackened water. He swore the Navy would never be caught sleeping again. That vow became a hunger that gnawed at him day and night until the first plan of attack began to take shape across his table. A plan so bold it would reach into waters few Americans had ever heard of. King traced his finger across the Pacific map. From Hawaii down toward the Solomon Islands, small dots scattered across blue emptiness. Somewhere among those islands, the Japanese were building a base, maybe an airfield, maybe something worse. If they finished it, Australia itself would be threatened, the lifeline of the Allies cut by wings and steel. That thought made King's jaw tighten. He called for his staff, his voice steady but sharp, like the edge of a blade drawn across paper. The Navy would not wait until autumn. It would strike in summer. It would land Marines where no one expected, seize the field before the Japanese could use it, and show the world that America had learned how to fight. Yet even as the orders spread across teletypes and coded channels, there were quiet doities whispered by men who read the same maps and felt their stomachs sink. They knew the ships were untested, the crews still green, the commanders still arguing over tactics and supplies. They knew what King refused to admit aloud, that war was never a straight line from decision to victory. It was a maze of storms, luck, and human error. Still, orders were orders, and every admiral beneath him obeyed. Within days, the great machinery of war began to turn. Dockyards rang with hammers, convoys assembled. Marines packed their gear and wrote hurried letters home, letters that many would never finish reading. In the silence between telegraph clicks, some officers wondered if this urgency was courage or madness. But none dared question the man who had stared down the chaos of Pearl Harbor and survived. King was the kind of commander who could make the impossible sound inevitable. He told his staff this would be the first step toward pushing Japan back. The moment the tide began to turn, no one could know that his decision would lead directly to the darkest night in American naval history, a night when pride and preparation would vanish in smoke, and thousands of men would vanish with them. The battle had not yet been named, but its shadow was already stretching across the sea. The sea was calm, the kind of calm that feels dishonest, a thin sheet of blue hiding the violence waiting underneath. Far to the south of Hawaii, Admiral Robert Gormley studied his new orders, the ink still drying as he realized what they meant. The operation called Watchtower had just been pushed forward by nearly 2 months, and his face stayed still for several seconds before he spoke. Moving an amphibious invasion that fast was like asking a man to build a cathedral overnight. Ships were not ready, aircraft were still scattered across the Pacific, and the men who would fight had barely trained together. But the order came from Admiral King himself, and in that voice there was no room for delay. Watchtower would target the Solomon Islands, two names circled in red on every chart, Tulagi and Guadalcanal. Intelligence reports said the Japanese were building a new airfield there, one that could cut the supply routes to Australia like a knife through rope. If they finished it, the entire southern Pacific would fall into shadow. Gormley understood the logic. He even admired it. But inside his chest something felt wrong. The Navy had never attempted a landing of this scale in the Pacific. The manuals were full of theory, but empty of experience. Each captain would be learning in real time, and mistakes at sea were not forgiving. In Washington, the planners called it bold. On the decks of the ships now being loaded with fuel and ammunition, the sailors called it madness. They packed crates in the heat, argued about maps, and prayed the enemy would be slower than the bureaucracy that sent them here. Some of the Marines practiced beach assaults on empty islands, shouting over engines and waves, never knowing how different it would feel when bullets were real. The tropical air smelled of salt and sweat, and over it all hung the invisible clock ticking down to August. Admiral Gormley walked the decks at night, looking at the restless crews, wondering if they understood the weight of what was coming. He tried to imagine their faces weeks from now, in the smoke of battle, when every decision would cost lives. He thought of his family back home, of letters he hadn't written, of the old Navy that fought with ships of steel and pride instead of uncertainty and exhaustion. But the ocean doesn't wait for doubt. The ocean only moves forward. By the end of July, the task force was assembled, an armada of gray hulls stretching across the horizon. They said it looked like power, but to Gormley, it looked like risk. The 1st Marine Division would go ashore, 11,000 men sailing toward an island most of them couldn't even pronounce. None of them knew this would become a graveyard for ships, a nightmare whispered in naval academies for decades. The anchors came up, the propellers turned, and the fleet began its long approach into history. As the ships disappeared over the curve of the sea, the last rays of sunlight turned the water the color of rusted metal, and the world felt strangely quiet. Far ahead, beyond that line of calm water, Japanese eyes were already watching, waiting for the moment when this bold experiment would collide with reality. The invasion was in motion now. It could not be stopped. Before dawn, the sea was a wall of darkness, the kind that seems to absorb every sound. Engines rumbled under the waves as the great convoy reached its position. The 1st Marine Division stood ready in their transports, sweat dripping down their backs despite the hour. Some prayed, some joked in low voice, others stared at the floor because they knew the moment the ramp dropped, everything would change. When the order came, it came quietly, passed from deck to deck like a rumor, and then the sky began to glow. It was August 7, and the first American offensive in the Pacific had begun. Offshore, destroyers and cruisers turned their guns toward the jungle. The bombardment started with a low roll that became thunder, waves of sound shaking the ships. Shells screamed across the dawn, tearing through trees and earth. Men covered their ears and felt the decks tremble beneath their boots. Overhead, carrier planes dived, their engines slicing the sky, releasing bombs that bloomed into orange clouds. For a few minutes, the entire horizon burned, and in that fire, the Marines believed the worst was already over. But the enemy on Tulagi and Guadalcanal was not like any they had fought before. On the smaller island, Japanese defenders waited in caves, refusing to surrender even as fire swept through their positions. Marines moved forward step by step, grenades bursting against siphon, flamethrowers pouring flame into the black mouths of tunnels. When the smoke cleared, nearly every defender was dead. They had kept their promise to fight to the last man. The Marines won, but the victory tasted like ash. Across the channel on Guadalcanal itself, the landings met almost no resistance. The jungle stood silent, except for birds and the hum of wombees. When the first Marines pushed inland, rifles ready, they found only abandoned camps, empty shovels, and the bones of an unfinished airfield. The Japanese laborers had fled into the interior, leaving behind tools, food, even their personal letters. It was eerie, as if the enemy had simply vanished into the trees. The Marines advanced quickly, nerves stretched tight, expecting ambush at every turn that never came. By the next afternoon, they had captured the airstrip, a wide scar of dirt and gravel surrounded by palm trees. They renamed it Henderson Field, though no aircraft had yet landed there. It would soon become the most fought-over patch of ground in the Pacific. But that day, under the brutal sun, the Marines stood on it and cheered, believing the battle was already won. They didn't know that the victory was only the first page of a long nightmare. Offshore, the ships continued unloading supplies, cranes creaking, cables hissing, waters shimmering with oil. Men carried ammunition, food, and drums of fuel ashore, while gunners scanned the horizon. No one noticed the distant specks that would soon become bombers. At dusk, as the heat softened and shadows grew long across the beach, the Marines dug foxholes and looked at the silent jungle. Somewhere out there, beyond the line of trees, the enemy was regrouping, preparing a response. Some Marines thought about home, about the girls they'd left behind, about baseball games and quiet evenings that felt like another life. Others simply lay on their backs, staring at the fading light, too tired to think. Above them, seagulls circled lazily, unaware that in less than 2 nights, this calm would shatter. Far to the north, beyond the clouds hanging over the Solomon Islands, a quiet man received a message that would change the night for thousands. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa stood in his office at Rabaul as a signal officer handed him the coded dispatch. American forces had landed on Tulagi and Guadalcanal. For a long moment, he said nothing, only stared at the paper, then turned toward the window, where the rain drifted across the harbor like smoke. The Americans had struck first, bold and fast, and now it was his turn to answer. His staff waited in silence, pens hovering above notebooks, knowing that whatever he decided next would echo through the entire South Pacific. Mikawa was 53 years old, a veteran of long voyages and endless planning rooms, but behind his calm eyes lived something far more dangerous, an instinct that understood risk like an old friend. He knew his fleet was outnumbered, knew he had no air cover, and knew that the Americans had carriers nearby still. Hesitation was not in his nature. The Imperial Japanese Navy had trained its officers to strike first, strike hard, and trust discipline, more than with fortune. He gave his orders, with the same calm voice he used to discuss weather. Every available cruiser and destroyer would assemble at once. They would move down the slot that very evening. In the operations room, maps spread across the tables, markers shifting with each new report. Reconnaissance aircraft confirmed what the radios already hinted. Dozens of enemy ships clustered near Savo Sound, unloading men and supplies. It was a tempting target, the kind that could break morale in one blow. Mikawa tapped his finger against the map and whispered a single word: attack. Around him, staff officers snapped to life. Messages flashed to every port and anchorage, summoning ships to gather for a night operation. Mechanics rushed to ready engines, sailors loaded ammunition, and fuel hoses hissed in the rain. Within hours, the quiet harbor turned into a storm of movement. Among the younger officers there were murmurs of doubt. They knew the enemy's air strength. They had seen what carrier planes could do. But Mikawa's confidence was contagious. He reminded them that their crews had trained for night combat longer than anyone else in the world. They had practiced in darkness until it felt like home. Their ships carried the most advanced torpedoes ever built. The Long Lance, silent and deadly, capable of striking from miles away. In daylight, they would be slaughtered, but at night, they would become ghosts. The enemy would never see them coming. As the evening deepened, Mikawa walked to the pier and looked at the cruisers moored side by side, their hulls reflecting the lantern light. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and still. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled, a sound that could have been guns. He watched his men preparing, tightening ropes, checking binoculars, faces set with quiet purpose. These were sailors who had spent years waiting for this chance to prove that all their training meant something. He bowed slightly toward the sea, a private ritual he never explained. Then he boarded his flagship Chokai and signaled for departure. The engines rumbled to life, vibrations running through the decks like a heartbeat. Behind him, the harbor lights faded one by one as the fleet slipped into the dark. The decision was made, the path chosen. Ahead lay the long black corridor of water that led to Savo Island. Within 2 days, those calm waves would glow red with burning oil. For now, they were silent, reflecting nothing but the moon. Mikawa turned from the window of his bridge, adjusted his cap, and whispered to no one, "Let the night decide who commands these seas." The fleet moved south beneath a ceiling of dark clouds. The moon hid behind shifting vapor, leaving the ocean a mirror of shadows. On the bridge of his flagship Chokai, Vice Admiral Mikawa leaned over a chart table, tracing the route toward Savo Sound. Around him, the command staff whispered quietly, passing notes, marking bearings, checking watches that glowed faintly green in the dark. No one raised their voice. The only sounds were the rhythm of the engines and the faint hiss of the sea along the hull. Mikawa's eyes never left the chart. He knew exactly what had to be done. His plan was simple, elegant, and merciless. During daylight, they would hide beneath cloud cover, using the islands as shields from American reconnaissance. When night fell, they would race through the narrow passage called the slot, using their superior optics to find the enemy before the enemy saw them. Once inside Savo Sound, the cruisers would open fire with guns and torpedoes almost simultaneously, destroying every warship guarding the transports. Then, if time allowed, they would turn their guns on the transports themselves. By dawn, they would be gone, disappearing north into the mist before American aircraft could strike back. The operation would last only a few hours. But in those hours, the balance of the Pacific could change. To make it work, Mikawa depended on surprise. The Americans believed no fleet would dare attack under such conditions. They trusted their radar, their lookouts, and their exhaustion. Mikawa trusted something else entirely: the night itself. For years, Japanese sailors had trained to fight blind. They could read silhouettes in darkness, estimate range from a flicker of muzzle flash, fire torpedoes by instinct. They had rehearsed this scenario again and again, until their reactions were almost ritual. Every man aboard his ships knew his role. At midnight, Mikawa gathered his officers in the wardroom. The air smelled of oil and sweat and tobacco. He spoke calmly, outlining the plan with gestures as sharp as the lines on the map. He told them they would strike south of Savo Island, hit hard, turn toward Tulagi, then withdraw. He reminded them to keep radio silence. He ordered all flammable materials thrown overboard: paint, wood, anything that could feed fire. The officers bowed and returned to their posts, some writing letters they would never send. Out on the decks, the sailors worked in near total darkness, preparing torpedoes, checking gun mounts, securing loose equipment. The sea was warm and smelled faintly of rain. Above them, the stars were gone, replaced by a thin band of lightning far on the horizon. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath. A few men murmured prayers, others simply touched the steel railing for luck. On every ship, the same signal hung ready. A simple phrase that would unleash chaos: attack at will. Shortly before dawn, Reconnaissance planes returned from scouting the Allied positions. Their reports confirmed what Mikawa had hoped. The enemy fleet was anchored and unprepared. Its picket destroyers spread too thin. Its crews exhausted from 2 days of air alerts. The Americans were sleeping inside a trap they didn't know existed. Mikawa folded the message, slipped it into his pocket, and looked out toward the dark horizon. His ships followed in perfect line, each wake a pale scar across the black water. Somewhere ahead lay history waiting to be written in fire. On the evening of August 8, Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner believed the situation was finally under control. His forces had survived 2 days of air raids, the Marines were ashore, and the Japanese seemed to be retreating. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the faint glow of fires on Guadalcanal's horizon, and felt a cautious relief. Somewhere in the back of his mind, however, a message from that morning lingered unresolved. A report about a group of enemy ships sighted far to the northwest. It had arrived too late, hours after the sighting, and by the time it reached him, the coordinates were meaningless. Turner decided it was nothing. That decision would cost him everything. The report's journey had been a tragedy in itself. An Australian reconnaissance plane had spotted a column of Japanese cruisers moving southeast. The pilot radioed his discovery, but the message bounced between stations, delayed by confusion and secrecy. At each stop, officers debated its importance, routed it through different commands, translated, retransmitted, lost minutes, lost hours. When it finally reached Turner aboard his ship, the ink on the page carried the ghost of a chance already gone. The admiral read it once, frowned, and set it aside. He assumed the Japanese were building another seaplane base, not preparing for a night attack. Every link in the Allied communication chain was frayed. The reconnaissance planes that guarded the northern approaches belonged not to Turner, but to General MacArthur's command, hundreds of miles away. The agreement between them was clear on paper and almost useless in practice. Messages passed through too many hands. Secrecy kept vital information from the very people who needed it most. Turner believed his northern sector was covered, that he would receive early warning if enemy ships approached. He was wrong. The warning system designed to protect him would instead bury him in silence. As the sun dropped behind the mountains of Guadalcanal, Turner gathered his staff for a briefing. Reports were read aloud, maps adjusted, positions checked. Nothing indicated danger. They discussed the next day's unloading schedule, the air patrols, the security of the transports. Turner's tone was calm, even optimistic. He told his officers that the enemy was likely regrouping for another air assault. No one mentioned the possibility of sea surface ships coming through the slot. It was unthinkable. Their radar would see them. Their picket destroyers would intercept them. Their guns were ready. Confidence filled the room like heavy air before a storm. Out at sea, the reality was very different. The Japanese fleet was already cutting through the black water. Their engines muffled, their formation tight, their torpedoes armed. On the American ships, crews settled into night routine. Some slept, others wrote letters or cleaned weapons. Half the gun stations were unmanned. Men needed rest after days of constant alert. The admiral himself attended a late conference with his subordinates aboard another vessel, leaving his main command temporarily leaderless. The ocean outside was calm and quiet, so calm that lookouts could hear their own breathing. At 9:30 that night, a final message arrived aboard Turner's ship, confirming the morning sighting once more. But again, it was old. Its data useless. Turner read it, shook his head, and whispered to an aide, "They're not coming tonight." Then he stepped outside, looked over the rail, and watched the reflections of distant lightning on the sea. Far beyond that horizon, Mikawa's cruisers were already moving at full speed, their wakes dissolving into the dark. The trap was closing, and not a single man in the Allied fleet knew it. The sailors who first gave that long stretch of water its name called it the Slot. On maps it was New Georgia Sound, a narrow corridor running through the Solomon Islands, silent and black under the moon. It was the kind of place where radar signals scattered off mountain ridges and sound carried for miles across the sea. That night, the Slot became a hunting ground. Vice Admiral Mikawa's cruisers slid into it, like blades sliding from their sheaths. Engines whispered, wakes dissolved behind them, and even the air seemed to hold its breath. For hours, the Japanese formation moved south in perfect line. The flagship Chokai, leading 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a single destroyer. No radio chatter broke the calm. Orders were given by flashing lamps and hand signals. Men stood at their posts without speaking, eyes glued to the black horizon, watching for the faintest glimmer of light that might reveal an enemy ship. On every deck the long lance torpedoes sat ready, warheads glistening in the faint reflection of the stars. Each weapon held enough power to rip a cruiser in half. As they entered the central passage, lightning flashed to the west, turning the clouds into ghostly shapes. Some sailors took it as a good omen, others as a warning. Mikawa himself stood quietly on the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back. He could feel the vibration of the deck plates under his boots, the heartbeat of the fleet. Every mile carried them deeper into danger. He thought of the morning reconnaissance reports that had revealed his position to enemy aircraft. The Americans must know by now, he told himself. Surely they would launch bombers before dusk. Yet no planes came. No shadows appeared in the sky. Perhaps fate was favoring him. By late evening, the Japanese crews began to relax slightly. The enemy's silence meant one thing. They hadn't been detected. A few men allowed themselves a sip of tea. Others tightened their helmets and whispered brief prayers. Above them, the first stars broke through the clouds, bright and cold. The sea was so smooth, it reflected their light like a second sky. Somewhere beyond that horizon waited the Allied fleet, resting, unaware that a line of steel and fire was cutting toward them. At 11, Mikawa summoned his division commanders to the bridge by signal lamp. The plan would not change. They would enter the sound south of Savo Island, strike the southern Allied group first, then swing north to finish the rest. Their advantage was surprise. Their enemy's weakness was exhaustion. If everything worked as planned, the battle would be over before the Americans even understood what was happening. His officers bowed, returned to their ships, and vanished into the night. When the formation passed the last of the islands, the ocean widened into a dark plain. Somewhere behind those ridges, the Marines were sleeping in their foxholes, dreaming of home. Above them, the sky began to dim again as another bank of clouds rolled in. The moonlight faded, leaving only darkness thick enough to touch. On the flagship's bridge, Mikawa watched his compass swing and gave a single command: increase its speed. The engines roared softly. Ahead, the Slot stretched empty and endless, a corridor leading straight into legend. On the other side of that same sea, the Allied fleet drifted at anchor, like a floating city half asleep. The glow of cigarettes flickered along decks, faint and careless, 1,000 small fires that said no danger was near. Admiral Victor Crutchley had divided his cruisers into 2 groups, one north of Savo Island, one to the south, each with destroyers as guards. Between them, 2 picket ships patrolled the entrance, their radar screens glowing faintly green. To everyone watching, it looked secure. The instruments would warn them if anything approached. Machines didn't tire. Machines didn't sleep. They believed that was enough. But radar was still a new promise, more fragile than anyone admitted. The men who operated those sets were young and untested. They could read echoes on calm seas, but in rain or heat or heavy cloud, the screens blurred with static. That night, the air was thick. the atmosphere unstable, the signals dancing with ghost returns. When the Japanese fleet entered the slot, the radar saw nothing. The pickets sailed their patterns in the dark, their operators yawning over mugs of coffee, tracing meaningless lines across gaze. Confidence whispered louder than caution. Admiral Crutchley himself had left his station to attend a meeting aboard Turner's flagship, leaving his own command temporarily blind. The discussion would last through the night, far from the men who were depending on him. In his absence, command passed to subordinates who didn't know they were now in charge. Orders tangled, signals went unanswered, and across the fleet, a strange quiet settled in. The quiet of men who think the danger has poised. On the decks of the cruisers, sailors leaned against railings watching the glow of the island fires, unaware those were reflections of their own coming doom. Among them, Captain Bode of the cruiser Chicago studied the horizon through his binoculars. He saw nothing but calm water, and assumed it would stay that way. He told his officers to stand down to condition 2, half the crew on watch, half allowed to rest. Guns were unmanned, ammunition doors sealed, lights dimmed. Somewhere below, men stripped off shirts, stretched out on steel decks, and drifted into shallow sleep. The sound of the engines became a lullaby. In the wardroom, a few officers spoke quietly about how easy the landings had been, how the Japanese seemed weaker than expected. Someone joked that the enemy had lost its teeth after Midway. Laughter rolled through the smoke, and with it came the smallest hint of arrogance, the belief that victory was already theirs. None of them realized that at that same moment, less than 50 miles away, another fleet was slicing toward them, unseen, undetected, unstoppable. Shortly before midnight, the destroyers on picket duty passed each other in opposite directions, unaware that between them, a line of enemy cruisers was slipping through. The sea was perfectly still, the stars bright above, and not a single lookout raised an alarm. The Americans believed their machines would save them. The Japanese believed only in training and silence. Before dawn, one of those beliefs would burn away in fire. The human body has limits even war cannot ignore. For 2 days, the sailors of the Allied fleet had been at battle stations, sleeping in bursts of minutes, eating whatever they could hold in one hand, while working the other. Every air raid alarm forced them to run, to load, to brace, to fight. By the third night, exhaustion clung to every man like a wet uniform. Muscles trembled, eyes burned, hands shook while reloading shells. Even the officers moved slower, their thoughts sluggish, their orders delayed. Fatigue had become its own kind of enemy. When darkness fell, the command finally relaxed the alert. The order spread like relief through the fleet. Condition 2. Half the guns manned, half the crew allowed to rest. On every ship, men crawled into bunks still smelling of smoke and oil. Some slept sitting upright at their stations, others on the bare deck beside their weapons. The night air was thick with diesel and sweat. A few sailors wrote letters by flashlight, the words crooked and slurred, promising to come home soon. Most never would. Aboard the cruiser Canberra, a Marine sentry leaned against the rail, listening to the soft rhythm of waves slapping against steel. In the distance, lightning flashed beyond the clouds, silent and distant, the kind of storm that never reaches the sea. He thought it beautiful in a strange way, unaware that what he saw wasn't weather, but artillery flashes reflecting off distant clouds from Mikawa's fleet, making its approach. He lit a cigarette, exhaled, and turned away. The ember vanished in the wind. Below deck, the engine rooms roared with steady heat. Mechanics wiped oil from their faces, thinking about how good it would feel to sleep a full night again. Up on the bridge, officers spoke in low tones about how well the operation had gone. The landings were secure. The Marines had their airfield. The Japanese air attacks had been driven off. Everything felt routine. Only a few older sailors kept their eyes on the dark horizon, feeling that familiar unease that veterans call the quiet before something breaks. On the destroyers, Blue and Ralph Talbot, the radar operators struggled to stay awake, their screens flickering with meaningless shapes. They adjusted dials, wiped their eyes, yawned, and stared into the blur. The hum of the equipment lulled them toward sleep. One of them reached for his coffee and spilled it, muttered a curse, then looked back up. Nothing. Just static. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for one long breath. Out there in the dark, less than 3 miles away, the lead ship of Mikawa's column slid past unseen. Above deck, the night breeze carried the scent of rain and distant jungle. Somewhere far to the south, thunder rolled across the islands. To the weary men of the Allied fleet, it sounded like weather turning. They had no idea it was the sound of engines, of steel, of a force moving toward them with deadly purpose. In the minutes before midnight, the first ripples of that movement brushed against their hulls, but no one noticed. The ocean rocked them gently, like a cradle. At the mouth of Savo Sound, 2 American destroyers patrolled their lonely beats. Blue moved on the western edge, Ralph Talbot on the eastern, each trusting the other to hold the line. Between them stretched a gap of water so wide a whole fleet could pass unseen. On their radar screens, faint echoes flickered and vanished. Ghosts of islands, bursts of static from the humid air. The operators called it clutter. They leaned back in their chairs, rubbing tired eyes, unaware that through that very gap, a column of Japanese cruisers was gliding south in perfect silence. The sea was black as ink, the sky low with drifting clouds. On Blue's bridge, an officer checked his watch, noted the time, and wrote a quick entry in the log. Rusnif, engines steady, no contact. He stepped outside for a moment, the air heavy with fault and heat. Somewhere behind him, the radar hummed, a steady sound like breathing. A lookout scanned the horizon with binoculars, saw nothing but darkness, and yawned. The ocean felt endless, empty, harmless. Aboard the flagship Chokai, Admiral Mikawa watched through powerful binoculars as the 2 destroyers drifted far to either side of his line. He could see the faint glimmer of their running lights through the haze. He gave a quiet order. Change course slightly west. Slow to cruising speed. The Japanese column adjusted as one, slipping past the pickets like shadows sliding through reeds. Not a single alarm sounded. The lead ships passed within 2 miles of the American destroyers, close enough that a sharp ear might have caught the distant thrum of their engines. But fatigue had dulled every sense on those patrols. For the next half hour, the Japanese fleet continued through the gap, each vessel following the pale wake of the ship ahead. Men stood at their stations, eyes wide, barely daring to breathe. They knew discovery meant death. But discovery never see. The Americans had placed their faith in machines, and the machines were deaf to ghosts. When the last ship cleared the patrol line, Mikawa stepped to the bridge rail and looked back. Behind him, the darkness swallowed the 2 destroyers once more, their radar beams sweeping the wrong directions. He allowed himself a single nod of satisfaction. The path to the anchorage lay open, the enemy still asleep. His attack would begin within the hour. Out on Blue, a young seaman glanced at the radar scope one last time before his shift ended. He thought he saw a blip near the edge of the screen, a faint beast that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He adjusted the gain, waited, saw nothing, and shrugged. Probably interference. He logged a false contact and left the room, closing the door behind him. The scope continued to glow, empty and green, as the Japanese cruisers slipped silently past toward the hearting of the Allied fleet. In the stillness that followed, the only sound was the whisper of wind across steel. The Pacific had taken a breath, holding it for the devastation about to come. The pickets had failed, and with them went the last chance for warning. Shortly after 1:30 in the morning, the first American lookout saw shapes moving across the water. At first, he thought they were friendly ships repositioning near the southern entrance of the Sound. The night was humid, visibility poor, and the glow of the islands made the horizon blur into shadow. He raised his binoculars, squinting through the mist. The shapes were larger than destroyers, darker than the sea around them, and moving fast. He opened his mouth to call the bridge, but in that same instant, flares burst overhead. The sky turned white. The sea turned silver. And the nightmare began. The destroyer Patterson was the first to act. Her captain shouted down the voice tube, "Sound General Quarters, stand by to attack." A moment later, he grabbed the microphone and sent a desperate radio message into the dark, his voice sharp, urgent, almost breaking. "Warning! Warning! Unknown ships entering harbor." The words crackled through static across the fleet, reaching radios half-tuned and barely manned. But it was already too late. The Japanese torpedoes were in the water before the warning finished transmitting. From the decks of Chokai and Aoba, dozens of torpedoes slid into the sea with almost no sound, their compressed air motors leaving only faint trails. Seconds later, Japanese gunners opened fire. The entire night exploded in color. Flares drifted downward on parachutes, bathing the harbor in an eerie daylight that shimmered off the waves. American sailors blinked against the glare, momentarily blinded. Through that glare came the first shells. They fell like hammer blows, the air filled with shrieks of metal, the roar of guns, the crack of splitting steel. On the Australian cruiser Canberra, men ran to their stations half-dressed, stumbling as explosions ripped through the decks. The first salvo from Chokai slammed into her side, shredding compartments and lighting fires from bow to stern. Bulkheads twisted, hatches jammed, cables snapped. Within minutes, she was dead in the water, listing heavily. Her captain, hit by shrapnel, refused to leave the bridge. He ordered his gunners to keep firing, but the guns never answered. Power was gone. The ship was burning alive. Patterson tried to close the range, her guns blazing into the white light, but she hit nothing. Around her, the ocean churned with chaos, ships silhouetted against falling flares, friend and foe indistinguishable. Sailors shouted questions no one could answer. Orders overlapped. The sound of secondary explosions echoed through the anchorage as ammunition magazines cooked off. It was a confusion turned to madness, a dream collapsing into fire. By the time the radio warning reached Admiral Turner's flagship, static and noise had swallowed most of it. Officers argued about its meaning, wondering if it was another false alarm. Then the horizon flashed again, brighter, closer. They realized too late that this was no drill. The enemy was already inside the harbor, and the night that had seemed so calm was now burning from one end to the other. Somewhere in the chaos, a young sailor on a transport ship stared up at the flares drifting over the water. The light painted his face white, the color of the disbelief. He whispered to no one, "They're here." Around him the ocean thundered. The warning had come, but too late to matter. The flares hung in the sky like dying suns, their pale glow shinging across the sea and turning night into a stage for destruction. In that strange light, the cruiser Canberra loomed broadside to the enemy, her gray hull gleaming faintly silver. The first Japanese salvos found her almost immediately. 10 8-inch shells struck the port side in less than a minute. Metal screamed as decks buckled. Fire burst from open hatches, racing through passageways thick with smoke and cordite. Men fell without knowing what hit them. Within moments, the proud Australian ship was crippled, her engines silent, her captain bleeding on the bridge, but refusing to abandon command. Across the water, the cruiser Chicago saw the flashes and turned hard to port. Her captain thought the burning light ahead was a friendly ship firing on an intruder. He didn't know the intruder was an entire fleet. Torpedoes from Kako, streaked toward him, faint white wakes cutting across the surface. One struck the bow, tearing it open like paper. The explosion threw men from the forecastle into the sea. Chicago's forward guns went silent, her bow nearly severed. Another shell hit the superstructure, blowing out communications. Orders shouted down. The tubes vanished into static and confusion. The Japanese formation advanced in perfect rhythm. From the bridge of Chokai, Admiral Mikawa watched as his ships fired in sequence, their guns flashing like lightning across the horizon. The roar of gunfire rolled over the water, echoing between the islands. It was over so quickly that many American crews never saw their attackers. They fired at shadows, at bursts of light, at reflections on the water. Some fired on their own escorts, mistaking silhouettes in the glare. The night became a kaleidoscope of panic. Canberra's gunners managed to launch a few shells in reply before the lights went out. When the power died, the ship lay helpless, her hull glowing from internal fires. The sound of secondary explosions thudded below deck as stored ammunition ignited. In the radio room, an operator still tried to send messages, his voice calm despite the chaos. But the antenna was gone, blown away by the first salvo. Outside, lifeboats caught fire before they could be lowered. The sea around the ship shimmered with burning fuel. From his position, north of the main fight, Mikawa could see the explosions reflecting off the clouds. The scene below looked almost unreal, a city burning underwater. He gave the order to turn toward the northern group. The Southern Allied formation was already destroyed. Less than 10 minutes had passed since the first flare dropped, and 2 Allied cruisers were crippled beyond repair. Aboard Chicago, Captain Bode ordered the ship to withdraw, convinced the fight was lost. As the cruiser turned away, flames from Canberra lit her retreat, the glow marking both ships as perfect targets. Japanese gunners shifted aim, shells landing closer with each salvo. Bode looked out at the burning water and realized he no longer knew where friend or foe lay. The radio crackled with fragments of orders, warnings, and cries for help. The words overlapped until they were meaningless. The calm sea that had rocked the fleet to sleep an hour earlier was now a graveyard in motion. Behind the Japanese line, sailors cheered softly each time an enemy ship erupted in fire. Mikawa silenced them with a glance. This was no triumph yet. The battle was only beginning, and the night still had more to give. The ocean burned like a city on fire. Through the drifting smoke, shapes moved without order, half seen and half imagined. The American cruisers were shooting at shadows, their crews blinded by their own searchlights and by the flares that still floated overhead. On the cruiser Chicago, Captain Howard Bode tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He could hear gunfire. He could see firelight, but the enemy's position was impossible to locate. The radar screens showed nothing. The voices coming through his radios were fragments of panic. Every question he asked was answered by static. Chicago's bow was gone, torn away by the torpedo that had struck minutes earlier. Seawater flooded compartments. Men scrambled to seal hatches. Others carried the wounded through corridors slick with oil. Bode paced the bridge, his mind racing. He thought the fight was already lost. Canberra was crippled. Communications were broken, and the night sky glowed orange to the east, where the enemy must be. He ordered his ship to turn away from the chaos, to regroup, to avoid the torpedoes he imagined still coming. What he didn't know was that his retreat would leave the rest of the southern group blind and unsupported. Behind him, the destroyers Patterson and Bagley tried to form up, but their commanders could barely see one another. Patterson's guns fired bursts into the darkness, her shells vanishing without effect. Bagley launched torpedoes toward the glare, not realizing Canberra was drifting into their path. The weapons sped away, disappearing into black water. No one would know until later that some of those torpedoes may have struck their own ally. Confusion had become the true enemy now, spreading faster than fire. The radio waves carried chaos. Some ships reported being under attack by planes, others claimed submarines. A few even insisted the Japanese were landing troops. Every voice overlapped. None carried command authority. Admiral Crutchley, still at his meeting aboard Turner's flagship, didn't hear any of it. In his absence, there was no central order, only individual captains fighting blind. On Chicago's bridge, Bode stared through his binoculars at the glare over Savo Island. He thought he saw a smaller ship crossing the enemy's path and ordered a turn to avoid collision. His helmsman obeyed, and Chicago swung westward, away from the fight. The sudden maneuver threw sailors off balance, some tumbling down ladders. The crew didn't know it yet, but they were leaving the battle entirely. The southern group's remaining ships would be left to burn a Musone. When the Japanese destroyer Unagi appeared briefly out of the smoke, Chicago's gunners opened fire, hitting nothing. The enemy disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving only ripples on the dark water. Moments later, silence returned. To Bode, it felt like survival. He didn't know that his decision to withdraw had sealed the fate of the northern group, which now waited unaware of the storm moving toward them. He thought he was escaping a trap. In truth, he was walking away from men who still believed help was coming. The sea grew quieter as Chicago limped westward. Behind her, Canberra burned down to her bones, a floating torch marking the entrance to Savo Sound. Above, the last of the flares faded and the night returned to darkness. But in that darkness, another fleet was already turning north, lining up for the next strike. War Horror Storytelling Assistant Pro. Winsure's plain text output. Exactly 5,000 characters excluding whitespace. No headings. No Foley. YouTube compliant. Optimized for American English narration. Always reports progress and next part. And confirms no digits are present. Farther north of Savo Island, another group of Allied cruisers patrolled their slow repeating course, unaware that a battle had already engulfed their comrades to the south. The ships Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria moved in formation, their guns quiet, their searchlights off, the crews half alert, half asleep. Captain Frederick Reefcole, commanding from the bridge of Vincennes, believed the night would be calm. His last report spoke only of distant flashes to the south, assumed to be anti-aircraft fire or stray lightning. No one imagined that those flashes were burning ships, that the southern group had been annihilated in minutes. In the still air, the sound of gunfire reached them faintly, dull echoes rolling across the water. A few officers mentioned it, wondered aloud if the Japanese were shelling the Marines on the island. Reefcole hesitated to break radio silence, without clear evidence. He ordered the ships to continue their patrol, confident that if any major threat existed, Admiral Crutchley or Captain Bode would have signaled by now. Neither man had. Communication lines that should have carried warning were dead. The northern group sailed on, blind and waiting. Above them, a few reconnaissance aircraft circled aimlessly, their navigation lights faint in the haze. The pilots saw fire on the horizon, but assumed it was from air raids earlier in the night. No one connected the pieces. The Japanese formation was now heading straight toward them, its columns splitting to attack from two sides. On Chokai's bridge, Admiral Mikawa studied the faint glimmer of American silhouettes through binoculars. They were perfectly species, perfectly exposed, drifting without awareness. He could hardly believe his fortune. The gods of war, he thought, had handed him the night. On Vincennes, the crew stood down from readiness. Many of the gunners had left their posts, eating rations, some even dozing beside their weapons. The deck lights were dimmed, the hum of generators the only sound. The air smelled of rain and exhaust. A signalman leaned on the rail, staring toward the island, and thought he saw flashes low on the horizon. He mentioned it to a petty officer who shrugged. Probably lightning. Everyone wanted to believe that. At 1:40 in the morning, the destroyer Patterson's desperate message finally reached them, broken and distorted. Warning, warning, unknown ships entering harbor. The words repeated, fading in and out of static. Reef Cole frowned, asked the radio operator to confirm, but the transmission died before details could be received. He ordered increased vigilance, but it was too late. The Japanese were already within striking distance, and their float planes had begun dropping new flares to illuminate the scene. As those flares blossomed above the ships, the men on the northern cruisers froze. The water around them turned silver, every shadow erased. The crews blinked, momentarily blinded, and in that instant, the searchlights of Chokai, Aoba, and Kinugasa snapped on. Beams of pure white light cut through the haze, locking onto the American cruisers like hunting dogs, finding scent. Orders were shouted on every deck, but confusion swallowed them whole. Guns swung toward the glare. Someone shouted not to fire, thinking those were friendly lights. Someone else shouted the opposite. The hesitation lasted only seconds, but in battle seconds decide everything. The first Japanese salvos roared out, tearing into the darkness. Shells slammed into Astoria's forward turrets, Quincy's bridge, Vincennes' hull. The northern group's quiet patrol had turned, in an instant, into a furnace. The men who had stood on deck moments ago, staring at lightning, now stared at death, falling from the sky. The flares turned the night white again, their glow rippling across the water as if dawn had come early. In that sudden brightness, the Japanese attack unfolded with terrifying precision. Mikawa's cruisers, divided into two columns, closed in on the northern Allied group from opposite sides of Savo Island. Each ship's guns thundered in sequence, their muzzle flashes lighting the black silhouettes of enemy vessels caught unaware. It was a crossfire so perfect it seemed choreographed, a deadly dance practiced 1,000 times in training and now performed to perfection. On the American ships, chaos took hold. Vanguinais tried to turn, but her rudder jammed after the first hits. Shells smashed into her superstructure, tearing open compartments, setting fires that burned blue and orange as aviation fuel ignited. Her gunners fired blindly toward the searchlights, hitting nothing. The heat on deck was unbearable, men falling back from their stations as flames licked around gun mounts. Still, some stayed, loading shells with burned hands, trying to answer fire with fire. Astoria's captain ran to the bridge in his pajamas, shouting orders over the roar of explosions. His ship fired a few salvos before enemy shells tore through the forward turrets, silencing them forever. A hit on the hangar deck set off the stored fuel and munitions of her float planes, turning the midsection of the ship into a roaring inferno. Flames rose high enough to reflect off the clouds above, a beacon for the enemy to aim at. The crew fought the fires with hoses that hissed and sputtered, their water turning instantly to steam. Quincy fared no better. As she tried to bring her guns to bear, torpedoes from Tenryu and Furutaka sliced through the water and struck her amidships. The blast lifted her from the sea, hurling men across the deck. Bulkheads crumpled, and a wall of flame rushed through the ship's corridors. Yet even as she died, Quincy fought back, her gunners managing to fire several volleys that struck Chokai's bridge. Shrapnel shattered glass, nearly killing Admiral Mikawa himself. He ducked instinctively as fragments whistled past his head, then straightened, calm once more. The risk only seemed to steel his resolve. He ordered the gunners to finish it. Within minutes, the Allied formation ceased to exist as a coherent force. Ships that had been patrolling in neat lines were now burning wrecks, their positions overlapping, their signals lost. Searchlights swung wildly, beams cutting through smoke and revealing the horrormen jumping from decks into flaming water, lifeboats burning before they touched the sea. The sound was deafening. a constant drumbeat of gunfire mixed with the screams of torn metal and the hiss of steam. Then, almost as quickly as it had begun, the firing slackened. The Japanese turned north to avoid collision, their guns falling silent except for the occasional burst from a rear turret. Behind them, the harbor glowed with the light of dying ships. The northern group had been annihilated in less than 20 minutes. 4 cruisers were burning, 2 already sinking, and the survivors clung to debris and water coated with oil. Above them, the flares drifted downward, sputtering out one by one until darkness returned. On Chokai's bridge, Mikawa exhaled slowly. The trap had closed perfectly. His officers congratulated him in low voices, but he didn't respond. He looked out across the flickering horizon and saw not victory, but ruin. Every explosion out there was a grave being opened. Still, the mission had succeeded beyond expectation. He ordered his fleet to regroup and prepare to withdraw. The Americans, he thought, would not recover from this. He was wrong, but that truth lay far ahead in a future he could not yet imagine. The cruiser Astoria drifted through the chaos, like a wounded animal, her decks awash with flame. The air was thick with smoke and streaks of the smell of burning paint and fuel hanging heavy. Men ran through corridors that glowed red, shouting names that vanished under the roar of the fire. In the engine rooms, gauges shattered from heat, steam hissing through ruptured pipes. The ship had been hit again and again, and still she floated, refusing to die. Her captain stood on the bridge, face streaked with soot, giving orders that no one could hear. He could feel the heat rising through the deck plates, knew the ship would not last, but he refused to leave her while any gun could still fire. The hits that had crippled Astoria came with terrifying precision. One shell struck her hangar, igniting the fuel of the aircraft stored there. Another pierced the bridge, killing men in an instant. Ammunition began to detonate below, each explosion throwing debris high into the air. The ship's midsection became a volcano of fire, flames reaching higher than the masts. The crew tried to fight back, but the heat drove them from their posts. Water sprayed from hoses turned to steam before it touched metal. Fire crews collapsed from exhaustion or burns, pulled aside by shipmates who took their places without hesitation. Above, the sky pulsed with gunfire from other ships still struggling to resist. Astoria's own guns fired a few more rounds into the haze, guided by flashes they could barely see. Some shells found targets, most vanished into smoke. Then her power failed, plunging the interior into darkness, broken only by the orange glow of flames. Without power, pumps stopped, communications fell silent, and the ship's heart went still. The captain ordered hand signals and messengers to carry commands, but half the runners never returned. On the open deck, sailors threw ammunition overboard to prevent explosions. Others carried wounded men to the rails, lowering them into rafts that instantly caught fire from the burning fuel spread across the sea. The water around Astoria was a mirror of flame, reflecting the dying light of the ship itself. From nearby vessels, observers could see her silhouette outlined against the inferno, a burning cross on the black horizon. Even Japanese gunners stopped firing for a moment, watching as the cruisers struggled against the inevitable. Inside the wardroom, a small group of sailors found refuge, the walls trembling around them. One of them wrote a quick note on the back of a chart, a last message for whoever might find it. He tucked it into his pocket and went back on deck. By then, the deck plates were glowing hot enough to scorch boots. He looked up once more toward the bridge and saw the captain still there, motionless, framed by firelight. Moments later, an explosion ripped through the forward magazine, and Astoria shuddered violently. The fire had reached her heart. At 2 a.m, the order finally came to abandon ship. Lifeboats were gone, burned away or smashed. So men leapt into the burning water, their uniforms igniting as they hit the surface. Some swam through oil slicks, coughing. eyes stinging from smoke. Behind them, the cruiser burned brighter than ever, her structure collapsing in slow motion. The sea hissed as molten metal met water. For an instant, the flames flared higher, then dimmed. Astoria's bow dipped. Her stern rose, and she slid beneath the waves, leaving only a swirl of fire and steam. Those who survived clung to floating debris, watching the light fade. The night grew dark again, but their eyes were filled with the afterimage of the ships burning. In that darkness, the sea felt alive, breathing heat and sorrow. The battle moved on without them, but for the men who had served aboard Astoria, time stopped with the final glow of their ship sinking into silence. The cruiser Quincy was dying, but she refused to go quietly. Flames raced along her decks, licking the barrels of her main guns as they swung to bear one last time. The Japanese shells struck in waves, smashing through her armor, turning compartments into furnaces. Each impact threw men to the deck, filling the air with sparks and choking smoke. Yet in the midst of that chaos, the gunners kept loading, shouting to each other through the roar. Orders were lost, command lines gone, but instinct took over. They fired where they saw flashes, and sometimes incredibly, they hit. On Chokai's bridge, Admiral Mikawa felt a shock under his feet. Shrapnel burst through the chart room windows, killing 2 officers beside him. Glass and filaments tore across the command deck, slicing through cables and maps. He ducked low, blood streaking his cheek. The shell had come from Quincy, a ship already doomed but still fighting. Her rounds tore into Chokai's bridge and nearly killed the admiral himself. It was an act of defiance that none who witnessed it would forget. Below decks on Quincy, men fought fires with buckets and bare hands. Others carried the wounded through smoke so thick it seemed solid. Ammunition hoists jammed, guns overheated, yet the crew refused to abandon their stations. The captain, Samuel Moore, stood on the bridge, voice raw from shouting. He could see the ship listing badly to port, her forward batteries silent, her aft guns still firing into the glare. Around him, sailors lay wounded or dead, the bridge covered in broken glass and twisted metal. When another shell hit the conning tower, fragments tore through his chest. He staggered once, then fell. The officer beside him caught the body, pressed a hand over the wound, and whispered that the ship would keep fighting. The torpedoes came next. 2 struck within minutes, one near the bow, one amidships. The blasts lifted the cruiser from the water, ripping holes through her hull. Water rushed in, flooding compartments faster than men could seal them. The ship began to roll. Still the guns fired, slower now, fewer voices answering. The last salvo roared from the stern turret, shells streaking into the darkness and exploding somewhere among the Japanese line. For a moment, the firelight reflected in the water looked like sunlight, a cruel illusion of morning. When the order to abandon ship finally came, it was spoken softly, almost as a prayer. The surviving crew helped each other over the rails, lowering rafts that caught fire before they touched the sea. Many simply jumped, choosing the black water over the flames. The heat from the burning oil seared their faces as they swam. Behind them, Quincy's structure groaned, her hull bending under the strain. The ship's bow lifted slowly, rising like a ghost out of the water. Flames poured from every hatch. Then, with a final shudder, she slipped beneath the surface, dragging the fires down with her. For a few seconds afterward, the sea glowed orange from the burning fuel. Pieces of debris floated past. Helmets, oars, a life ring scorched black. The men who survived clung to whatever they could find, calling for friends who would never answer. Above them, the Japanese ships were already turning away, their engines rumbling through the smoke. Quincy's defiance had scarred them, but the victory was still theirs. In the darkness that followed, only the sound of hissing steam remained. The ocean swallowed the fire, and the place where the ship had stood became empty once more. The flagship Vincennes fought her battle alone. Her crew had seen the horizon blaze with the deaths of Quincy and Astoria. Yet they still believed they could hold. Searchlights from the Japanese cruisers cut across the smoke, carving white tunnels through the darkness. In those blinding beams, Vincennes glowed like a target drawn in fire. Her guns roared back, shells hammering into the night. Some found water. Others found nothing. The Japanese replied with a storm of steel. The first torpedoes struck the port side, explosions thundering beneath the hull. The ship heaved upward, then settled, wounded but still fighting. Captain Frederick Reefcole gripped the rail on the bridge, feeling the vibration of every hit. He shouted for more speed, for more fire, but communications were already gone. Below him, his sailors moved through corridors that pulsed with orange light, dragging hoses through knee-deep water, dodging falling cables. One hit after another shook the decks. Shells punched through the upper works, setting the midship hangar ablaze. Stored aviation fuel turned the fire into a living thing, climbing the masts, wrapping around the funnels like a serpent of flame. The heat drove men back from their guns as, skin blistering, hair singeing as they tried to keep loading. Within minutes, every main turret was silent. A shell had struck the forward fire control tower, wiping out the gunnery team. The command circuits melted from heat. The captain turned to his executive officer, both men knowing the truth without words. The ship was lost. Yet they would not abandon her until the crew had a chance to escape. Orders spread by runners through choking smoke. Prepare to abandon ship. Some refused to go, choosing to keep fighting. The last working gun on the starboard side fired 3 defiant salvos before an explosion tore it apart. As the list increased, the fires burned hotter. Ammunition magazines were flooded to prevent detonation. But the effort came too late. The decks warped, the steel screaming under its own weight. In the engine room, a final order echoed down the voice tubes. Shut her down. The engineers obeyed, then made their way toward the ladders, wading through rising water. Many never reached the deck. Above them, the captain stayed until the last possible moment. Witnesses from nearby ships later said they saw him still on the bridge, lit by the glow of his dying command, hands steady on the rail as if steering into the flames. When the final torpedo hit, Vincennes rolled hard to port. Men leapt into the sea, vanishing beneath waves slick with oil. Others clung to floating wreckage, coughing from the smoke and salt. The cruiser's lights flickered once more, then went dark. A moment later, the ship's bow dipped sharply, pulling the stern high. The ocean swallowed her whole in less than a minute. Around the survivors, the water boiled with debris, the air filled with the hiss of burning fuel. The sea itself seemed to whisper as the fires spread across its surface, carrying the light of their ship's death farther than sound could reach. For the men who lived, the night stretched endless. They watched the burning glow fade into the horizon, each wave reflecting the last wreckage of their ship. Somewhere far beyond, the Japanese cruisers turned north, their guns finally silent. The ocean returned to darkness. But the darkness was different now, heavier, alive with memory. The sound of their comrades' voices lingered in the ears of every survivor, mingling with the hiss of waves and the faint crackle of fire dying on the sea. By 2:15 in the morning, the sea around Savo Island was a basin of burning oil. 4 Allied cruisers lay crippled or sinking, their wreckage scattered across the Sound. From the bridge of his flagship Chokai, Vice Admiral Mikawa watched the glow fade behind him as his ships formed back into line. The night had gone exactly as he'd imagined, yet the sight before him brought no satisfaction. Fires climbed into the clouds, painting the undersides red. It was victory, yes, but victory that reeked of flesh and fuel. He gave a quiet order to cease fire, The guns fell silent, leaving only the crackle of burning water and the distant cries of survivors drifting across the waves. The Japanese formation slowed to regroup. Signal lamps blinked from ship to ship, their messages brief, precise, rehearsed. Damage reports came in. A few hits on Aoba, minor wounds on Kinugasa, light casualties on Chokai's bridge. Nothing serious. Mikawa had achieved total surprise and escaped nearly untouched. His officers approached, eager to press the advantage, but he raised a hand for silence. His eyes remained fixed on the southern horizon, where the transport ships still waited at anchor. They were defenseless, lit by the reflection of the fires. He could almost see them through the smoke. "Should we strike again?" one captain asked. It was the question hanging in every mind. Ahead lay the enemy's lifeline, hundreds of tons of supplies, ammunition, food, and the Marines who needed them to survive. Sink those ships, and the entire American landing would collapse. Mikawa didn't answer right away. He studied his charts, then looked up at the eastern skyphme. The faintest gray had begun to spread along the edge of the world. Dawn was coming. He knew that meant American planes, and his ships had no cover, no chance against daylight attack. He ordered a turn north, away from the anchorage. The helmsman hesitated, then obeyed. The cruisers began their slow arc, their wakes crossing the oil slick, like scars. Around them, the sea hissed as debris burned and sank. Some of his officers argued that they still had ammunition left, that they could finish what they had started. Mikawa shook his head. "We leave now," he said quietly, "before the sun betrays us." It was the sound of caution, defeating ambition. As the ships retreated up the slot, the smell of smoke followed them. Some sailors looked back through binoculars and saw the last moments of the Allied fleet. The twisted hulls half submerged, men clinging to wreckage, the water alive with small fears that drifted like lanterns. No pursuit came from the Americans. The survivors were too broken to fight. Behind the Japanese, the sound of explosions faded until even the echo was gone. The only noise was the steady thrum of engines and the gentle slap of waves against hulls. Mikawa stood alone at the rail, the night wind brushing his face. His staff congratulated him again, but he barely heard. He had destroyed the enemy's warships, yet he felt no triumph. The men who had died out there, friend and foe alike, would haunt this place for generations. He looked once more toward the faint red glow on the horizon and whispered, almost to himself, "We have done enough." The fleet vanished into the smoke, leaving behind a sea that would soon be known by another name, Iron Bottom Sound. In the hours after the battle, the sea went strangely quiet. The smoke still hung over Savo Sound, drifting in ribbons across the dim horizon. Beneath it floated the shattered hulks of 4 cruisers, their fires flickering like candles, fighting to stay alive. To the north, Mikawa's fleet steamed steadily away, engines pulsing with the rhythm of escape. Inside his flagship's bridge, the admiral stood beside a shattered window, staring down at his charts. His officers waited for an order that did not come. The question on every face was the same. Should they turn back and finish the job? The argument began softly and grew urgent. Some captains insisted the transports must be destroyed. Those ships held everything the Americans needed to hold Guadalcanal: food, fuel, ammunition, and hope. Without them, the Marines ashore would starve and surrender. Others warned of dawn. The sky in the east was already paling, the stars fading one by one. The fleet had no air support, no friendly cover within hundreds of miles. By sunrise, American planes could be overhead, and daylight meant death. Mikawa listened, silent, his expression unreadable. He thought of the Japanese naval staff's warning before he left Rabaul. Never risk what cannot be replaced. Heavy cruisers took years to build, years Japan no longer had. 5 of them now followed him, all vital, all irreplaceable. He imagined them trapped in daylight, caught under the bombing he had seen destroy so many ships before. He imagined the headlines if he lost them all for the sake of a few transport ships. Then he imagined what would happen if he sank them and left the Marines stranded, the first American offensive crushed in its cradle. The war might change course completely. The balance between glory and ruin was a knife's edge. His chief of staff leaned close, voice barely above a whisper. "We still have torpedoes. The enemy is helpless." Mikawa turned his gaze toward the southeast, where the faint red glow still marked the burning wrecks. He saw no movement there, no pursuit, no aircraft in the sky. The temptation was enormous. He could end it now, erase the enemy's foothold, strike a blow history would never forget. But doubt whispered louder. Without navigation charts, the last set had burned when a shell hit Chokai's chart room. His course through the narrow sound would be blind. If he turned back and ran aground, daylight would trap them all. He knew the sea as well as he knew fate, and fate never forgave greed. At 2:23, his decision came in a single word: retreat. The signal flashed to every ship. The helmsmen swung their wheels, and the fleet turned north into the darkness. The engines deepened their hum as the ships accelerated, leaving behind the glow of fire. Mikawa stepped outside to the bridge wing, letting the wind cool his face. Below him, the black water reflected streaks of orange and gold. He whispered to no one, "Enough for one night." Had he known that Admiral Fletcher's carriers had already withdrawn Feker from the area, leaving the ski empty of American planes, he might have chosen differently. But he did not know. He made the choice that seemed wise, the choice that would haunt him forever. The cruisers vanished into the northern mist, their wakes glowing faintly in the reflection of distant fires. Behind them, the Marines on Guadalcanal woke to find the sea silent, unaware how close they had come to disaster. History would remember Mikawa's victory as brilliant, and his retreat as the moment that brilliance slipped through his fingers. When the first light of morning crept over the Solomon Islands, the ocean looked calm again. The storm of fire had burned itself out, leaving only drifting smoke and the broken shapes of ships that once carried thousands of men. Oil spread across the water in black sheets that shimmered with color under the pale sun. Seagulls circled low, creeing over the wreckage. The sounds of battle were gone, replaced by the crackle of cooling metal and the groans of hulls settling deeper into the sea. It was August 9, a morning that smelled of salt and ashes. On the surface floated survivors, hundreds of them, clinging to debris, life jackets, anything that would keep them above the slick of oil. Some called for help, their voices weak and hollow. Others floated silently, eyes open, but seeing nothing. From the horizon, small boats moved among them, sailors pulling the living from the water, counting the dead as they went. Every face they found was coated with soot, every uniform soaked in fuel. The men had escaped the fire, but the sea still wanted them. The Australian cruiser Canberra lay on her side, still burning slowly. Her decks were twisted and blackened, the once bright flag now a sheet of gray ash. Admiral Turner stood on the deck of his flagship, watching her through binoculars. He had to make a choice, attempt to tow or scuttle her. The fires were too deep, the ship beyond saving. He gave the order to sink her. American destroyers moved in, their torpedoes leaving pale wakes across the water. Moments later, Canberra slipped beneath the waves, taking 84 of her crew with her. The sea closed over them without a ripple. Nearby, the wreck of Quincy had already vanished, leaving only a patch of burning oil where her stern had gone under. Astoria still floated, stubbornly upright, though gutted by fire. Her crew fought the flames all morning, passing buckets hand to hand, refusing to give up. For a time, it looked as if they might survive her. Then the fires reached her magazines. A deep rumble shook the air, and the ship began to roll. Men jumped into the water as she capsized, her bow rising high before sliding beneath the surface. The sound of her final plunge echoed across the sound like a door closing on the living. On the transport ships farther east, the Marines watched the smoke rising from what had been their protection. They didn't know the full scale of what had happened, only that the sea was now empty and the horizon haunted. Turner's command had been broken, his fleet crippled, yet the mission on shore remained. The Marines were still there, stranded on an island surrounded by an enemy that would not stop coming. By noon, the sun burned away the last of the mist. Debris floated everywhere, helmets, rafts, splintered wood. The survivors pulled themselves onto what remained, squinting into the harsh light. Many didn't speak. Some whispered prayers. One man, his hands still shaking from the cold, looked back at the horizon and said softly, "It's over." But it wasn't. The war would rage here for months, and the sea that had claimed their ships would soon have many more. The first day after Savo Island was only the beginning of the reckoning. 2 days after the battle, the ocean north of the Solomon Islands looked peaceful again. A lie told by the sea. Beneath that calm surface, American submarines hunted. Lieutenant Commander John Moore, aboard the submarine S-44, scanned the horizon through his periscope, the sweat on his haunts, mixing with the oil from the controls. The water was clear, the light perfect, and far in the distance, he saw them 4 Japanese cruisers moving in line, heading home from their victory. Among them sailed the heavy cruiser Kako, her hull glinting faintly in the morning sun. Moore lowered the scope, his voice low but steady. "We have our target." The crew moved like ghosts, quiet and efficient. In the cramped torpedo room, men loaded 4 Mark 14 torpedoes into their tubes, checking every seal twice. The submarine turned slowly, positioning itself across the Japanese course. Above them, Kako's sailors leaned on rails, smoking, unaware they were being watched. They were tired but elated, still riding the pride of their triumph at Savo Island. Some joked about how quickly the Americans had run, how easy the victory had been. Their laughter carried faintly across the calm water, unheard by the hunters waiting below. At 9:15, Moore gave the order to fire. The submarine shuddered as 4 torpedoes left their teeth in sequence, white trails racing toward the unsuspecting cruiser. The men counted under their breath, waiting. Then came the first explosion, deep and heavy, followed by 2 more in rapid succession. Through the periscope, Moore watched Kako stagger, her hull torn open by the blasts. Steam and smoke billowed from her sides, sailors running in panic along her decks. The 4th torpedo missed, but it didn't matter. The damage was fatal. Within minutes, the cruiser began to list, her bow dipping sharply. Lifeboats splashed into the water as Japanese destroyers rushed to her aid. From the submarine's control room came muffled cheers, the kind born not of triumph, but of release. They had struck back, if only for a moment. Moore ordered the boat to dive deeper, turning away from the scene as depth charges began to fall. Each blast rolled through the hull like a hammer blow, but the submarine held steady. When the explosions stopped, they surfaced to periscope depth once more. The view through the lens showed only oil slicks and debris. Kako was gone, swallowed by the same ocean she had ruled days before. Word of the sinking spread quickly through the Allied ranks. Newspapers back home would never know the details, but to the men still fighting for Guadalcanal, it felt like justice. The ocean that had taken so many now returned one of its predators to the deep. In Japan, the loss barely registered amid the reports of triumph. The Navy called it an unfortunate accident, a price paid for glory. But to those who had watched their ship go down, it was something else, a reminder that no victory lasts forever, and the sea never forgets. That night, as S-44 slipped away into the dark, the crew stood at their stations, listening to the steady hum of the engines. They knew they couldn't bring back the ships lost at Savo, but they had avenged them, in part. The ocean around them was black and endless, hiding both ghosts and hunters. For the first time in days, the men smiled. The sea had taken, but it had also given. The destroyer Jarvis had been struck before the great battle even began. A torpedo from a Japanese bomber had ripped into her hull 2 days earlier, shredding her bow and flooding her forward compartments. Somehow she survived, her crew fighting fires and sealing bulkheads until she could limp toward safety. By the time the main battle of Savo Island erupted, Jarvis was already gone from the anchorage, steering alone through the dark, trying to reach Australia for repairs. Her radio had been destroyed, her navigation lights out. She moved through the night like a wounded animal, unseen and unheard, leaving behind the burning wrecks of her comrades. At dawn on August 9, Jarvis crept southward along the edge of the Coral Sea, her speed no more than 7 knots. The ship listed to port, her decks twisted, her forward guns silent. The crew worked without rest, clearing debris and pumping out water. They had no way to call for help, no way even to know if anyone knew they were alive. The nearest friendly port was more than 800 miles away. Still, they pressed on. Every man aboard understood that their odds were thin. Hope came only in small moments, in the sight of the sunlight breaking through clouds, or the rhythm of the engines still turning beneath their feet. That afternoon, high above the sea, Japanese reconnaissance planes searching for American targets spotted a lone ship crawling south. From altitude, her silhouette looked larger than it was. The pilots mistook her for a damaged cruiser fleeing the battle. Orders went out immediately, and a squadron of 16 bombers diverted from their original course to intercept. The destroyer's fate was sealed before her crew ever saw the enemy coming. The first formation appeared just after noon. Jarvis's lookouts shouted the warning, and men ran to the few guns still operational. The sky filled with the droning sound of vengeance. Black specks grew larger, then dived, sunlight flashing off their wings. Anti-aircraft guns opened up, tracers stitching the air. But the bombers came through the fire like hawks. Explosions ripped across the deck, tearing away railings, smashing through compartments already weakened from earlier damage. Fires spread instantly, fueled by oil and ammunition. The crew fought back with everything they had, shooting down 2 attackers and damaging a third. But it wasn't enough. One bomb struck near the aft magazine, detonating with a roar that lifted the destroyer out of the sea. The blast shattered what remained of her structure, blowing men overboard in a rain of steel. Water poured through the hull as the ship broke apart. Still, some gunners kept firing until the deck tilted beyond reach. A few survivors clung to floating debris, waving weakly as the bombers circled once more. Then Jarvis rolled to port, her bow sinking first, her stern rising briefly against the sunlight, before vanishing beneath the surface. She went down in silence. There were no survivors. 233 men went with her into the deep, leaving behind only a slick of oil and fragments of wood. For days afterward, passing ships saw bits of wreckage drifting on the currents, but no bodies. It was as if the sea had swallowed the destroyer whole, erasing her from sight and sound. Her name would later appear on casualty lists, a single line among many. But to those who had served with her, Jarvis remained a ghost ship, a reminder that in war, even those who escape the first disaster may still meet their end in its shadow. By the evening of August 9, the sea around Guadalcanal was eerily still. The fires that had raged through the night were gone, the smoke carried away by the trade winds. What remained was silence, a vast emptiness stretching from shore to horizon. Admiral Turner stood on the deck of his flagship, watching the last of the transports raise anchor. The decision to withdraw had already been made. Without air cover from Admiral Fletcher's carriers, his ships were sitting targets for Japanese bombers. He hated the thought of leaving the Marines behind, but he had no choice. The ocean no longer belonged to him. Around the anchorage, cranes swung slowly, lifting the final loads of supplies from the holds and dropping them onto the beach. Marines waded through waist-deep water to grab crates, pushing them all in before the tide turned. Every man knew the withdrawal was coming, though none spoke it aloud. They could see the destroyers moving toward open water, could hear the distant rumble of engines as the cruisers turned their bows to the east. The once crowded harbor that had felt like a fortress now looked abandoned, haunted. Turner's officers tried to argue for a few more hours, time to unload more food, more ammunition, anything. Turner shook his head. At first light, he said quietly, "We'll be nothing but targets." He gave the signal to depart. Across the fleet, anchors came up, cables rattling through metal guides. The transports began to mooy, their wakes cutting white lines across the dark surface. The sound of engines echoed off the jungle hills, startling the birds that had settled there after the battle. From the beaches, the Marines watched in silence as their lifelines sailed away. Some waved half-heartedly. Others simply stared. They were exhausted, still processing the violence of the past 2 days. The sight of the ships disappearing one by one filled them with an unease that no one could voice. The air smelled of salt and mud and something else, fear. They had come expecting victory and security, and now they were alone on an island, crawling with an unseen enemy. Out at sea, Turner looked back once more through his binoculars. The coastline was already fading into the evening haze. Somewhere beyond those trees, men he had brought here were digging in for survival. He knew many of them would die waiting for supplies that might not come soon enough. His chest tightened, but he said nothing. Orders were orders, and his duty was to preserve what was left of the fleet. Still, as the last light disappeared, he couldn't shake the image of the men on the shore, staring after him. By nightfall, the harbor was empty. The waves rolled gently against abandoned landing craft, their ropes creaking in the tide. The jungle beyond whispered with the sounds of insects and distant surf. No gunfire, no engines, no voices, just the hollow quiet left behind when the living retreat and the dead are gone. Savo Sound had become a graveyard. For the first time since the invasion began, the water reflected only the moon. And in that reflection, the empty sea looked endless. When the last transport vanished beyond the horizon, the men of the 1st Marine Division stood staring at the empty sea. The sound of engines faded, replaced by the whisper of surf breaking against the beach. For a few seconds, no one spoke. They had landed believing they were part of a grand offensive, the first step in turning the war. Now they were alone, an island garrison cut off from the world, surrounded by jungle and enemies they could not see. The stillness was worse than gunfire. It carried the weight of realization. The supplies left behind were far less than promised. Food enough for 2 weeks if rationed carefully. Ammunition barely sufficient for one serious fight. Fuel running low. The Marines began sorting through what had been unloaded, stacking crates of rice, cans of beans, drums of gasoline salvaged from half-sunken barges. They inventoried everything with grim precision. Henderson Field, the unfinished Japanese airstrip they had captured days earlier, would have to become their lifeline. Engineers began clearing debris, flattening the runway with bulldozers the enemy had left behind. The airfield smelled of diesel and burnt earth, the scent of both opportunity and desperation. At night, the jungle came alive. Strange cries echoed from the trees, and the darkness felt heavy with eyes. The men dug foxholes near the perimeter, their rifles always within reach. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by the snap of branches or the whine of insects. Some Marines whispered about the battle offshore, wondering how many ships had been lost, How many friends now lay beneath the water? Others stayed silent, focusing on tasks that kept their minds from wandering too far. Building defense, cooking what little rations they had, writing letters that would never be mailed. The first Japanese air raid came 3 days later. The Marines heard the engines before they saw the planes, a rising hum that made every heart jump. They scattered for cover as bombs fell across the airfield, throwing dirt and smoke into the sky. When the raid ended, the men looked around at the damage craters, where tents had been, fires in the grass, and the realization that more would come. But the attack also brought something unexpected: resolve. If they were to survive, they would have to fight for every inch of the island without expecting help. Henderson Field became their world. They worked by day, fought by night, rebuilt after every bombardment. The jungle closed in around them, hiding both allies and enemies. The air smelled of mud and sweat, the kind of heat that never cooled. Some men carved names into empty shell casings and placed them near their foxholes like offerings. Others collected Japanese equipment, repurposing it for their own defense. The Marines turned isolation into defiance. They had come to take the island, and they would not give it back. Still, every night when the wind shifted, they could smell the sea. It carried with it the faint scent of oil and smoke, a reminder of the ships that had died to bring them here. The men didn't speak of it, but in quiet moments, they looked toward the water, half expecting the silhouettes of new ships to appear. None did. The ocean remained empty, a mirror reflecting their solitude. They were stranded soldiers at the edge of the world, but they were still Marines, and as long as they held Henderson Field, the island, and perhaps the war itself, still had a heartbeat. In the days that followed the retreat, the shock of defeat settled over the American fleet like a fog. Reports trickled in from survivors, each one darker than the last. 4 heavy cruisers gone, 1 badly damaged, over 1,000 sailors dead. The numbers didn't seem real. In Washington, the news was softened for the public. Words like setback and naval action near Guadalcanal masking what had truly happened. But inside the Navy, no one could hide from the truth. Savo Island was the worst surface defeat in American history. And behind every statistic was a question that burned in every officer's mind. How had this happened? In the days that followed, inquiries began. Admiral Turner wrote his reports with a calm pen, but the guilt bled through every line. He blamed poor reconnaissance, bad communication, exhaustion. Others pointed at faulty radar, at the divided command, at the arrogance that had grown since Midway. There was truth in all of it, but no single cause could explain the scale of the disaster. The Navy had been unprepared for an enemy that fought like ghosts in the dark. The Japanese had turned the night itself into a weapon. Now the Americans would have to learn to do the same, or die trying. On every surviving ship, changes began immediately. Radar operators trained until their eyes ached from staring at screens. Gunnery crews drilled through the night, learning to fight blind. New codes were written for communication between commands, so that messages would no longer vanish into bureaucratic silence. The lessons were carved into procedure and policy, but they had first been written in the water with fire and blood. The ocean around Savo still held those lessons, shimmering red beneath the waves. In Pearl Harbor, a board of investigation met in somber rooms where the air smelled of ink and coffee. Officers spoke in measured tones, analyzing every movement of every ship, tracing each mistake down to the second. But beneath the professionalism was something more human: a quiet shame, the kind that lingers after pride has been broken. They studied radar returns that had shown nothing, weather reports that hid nothing, men who had seen nothing. One admiral said it best in a whisper barely caught by the stenographer: "We forgot what darkness means." Yet from that darkness, new resolve grew. Within weeks, night fighting divisions were formed. training under red lights in the calm waters off Hawaii. The men studied Japanese tactics, learning how to read the rhythm of enemy gunnery, how to maneuver by instinct instead of command. Slowly, painfully, the lessons of Savo Island transformed into doctrine. Each exercise carried the weight of ghosts. Each new radar contact recalled the voices lost on that terrible night. For the sailors who survived, the lesson was simpler, but harder to live with. They had seen what overconfidence cost. They had watched the sea turn against them, indifferent and merciless. They spoke less, drank more, carried the silence of the dead in their eyes. Every time they heard the thud of artillery practice or the hum of engines starting, they remembered the sound of that night, the flares, the torpedoes, the screams. Savo Island would never leave them. It had become part of their training, their nightmares, their blood. Months passed, and the waters north of Guadalcanal grew heavy with ghosts. The Americans called it Iron Bottom Sound, a name spoken softly, half out of reverence and half out of fear. Beneath that calm blue surface lay the twisted skeletons of ships from both sides, steel tombs sealed by depth and silence. Divers who later descended through the clear water said it felt like entering a graveyard. Sunlight filtering down through schools of fish that moved between gun barrels and broken hulls. The ocean had preserved everything, from shattered bridges to the rusting turrets, as if unwilling to let go of what it had taken. Sailors who sailed those waters afterward said their compasses sometimes spun for no reason, their radios crackled with phantom voice. Superstition spread quickly. No one liked to anchor in the middle of the sound at night. The waves seemed to whisper against the hulls, a sound that could almost be mistaken for names being called. Some claimed they saw faint glows under the water, as though the fires from that August night still burned far below. Others dismissed it as imagination, yet few chose to test it. Even during calm weather, the sea there never felt empty. Each wreck had its own story. Canberra, the Australian cruiser, lay on her side in shallow water, her hull split open like a wound. Quincy rested deeper, upright, but hollow, her decks covered with coral. Astoria lay broken in two pieces, her stern pointing upward like a monument. And farther north, the remains of Mikawa's victim, Kako, rested quietly, her torpedo scars still visible after the years. Every ship carried its ghosts, every name carved into metal, still whispered by the current. Together, they formed a fleet of the dead. For the Americans who returned to fight again in the Solomon Islands, passing through Iron Bottom Sound became a ritual of remembrance. They would stand at the rails, remove their caps, and watch the waters slide past. Some men saluted. Others simply stared. The surface looked ordinary, the same endless blue as any other patch of the Pacific. But they all knew what lay beneath. More than 50 ships, from destroyers to cruisers to transports, entombed in the deep. Every mile of water there hid history written in rust. After the war, historians would describe the Sound as a symbol of place where hubris met reality, where technology and courage collided with the chaos of the sea. But for the men who had been there, it was simpler. It was where friends had vanished. It was where lessons had been learned too late. Even years later, veterans who spoke of Savo Island did so quietly, eyes unfocused, as if still listening to distant echoes. The Pacific had claimed many battlefields, but none like this. Iron Bottom Sound was not just a name on a map. It was a warning written in water, a place where time itself seemed to stop, holding forever the moment when the sea decided who would live and who would not. Years later, historians would gather in quiet rooms lined with maps and photographs, trying to understand what had really happened that night in August. They argued over tactics, over courage, over fight, but most of all, they argued over one haunting question. What if Admiral Mikawa had turned back? What if, after destroying the Allied warships, he had pressed the attack on the transports anchored near the shore? Some believed that decision changed the course of the Pacific War. Others said it saved Japan's remaining cruisers from annihilation. Between those two truths hung the shadow of everything lost. The records told both sides of the story. Mikawa's logs showed prudence and calculation. He had feared daylight, feared the vengeance of American carrier aircraft. He believed dawn would bring destruction from the sky. To stay meant death. Yet intelligence gathered later revealed that the American carriers had already withdrawn, leaving the sea empty and defenseless. Had Mikawa known that, he could have wiped out every transport, stranded the Marines, and perhaps broken the first American offensive of the Pacific. But he didn't know. In war, knowledge is luck, and luck is everything. Some historians praised him as cautious and wise, a commander who understood the value of preservation. Others called him timid, claiming he threw away the chance to end the campaign in a single morning. They compared him to admirals of old, men who gambled everything on one decisive stroke. In the quiet halls of naval academies, cadets debated his choice, drawing arrows across maps that led to imagined outcomes. Every diagram ended differently. Every conclusion felt incomplete. For Mikawa himself, the debate was personal. In interviews after the war, he spoke softly of that night, his words deliberate, careful. He said he had followed reason, not fear. Yet his eyes betrayed something else when he paused, the flicker of regret that no amount of logic could erase. "If I had known," he once said, "I would have turned back." That simple admission echoed louder than any order he had ever given. The Americans too dissected the same question from the other side. Officers who had survived Savo wondered what might have happened if their communications had worked, if radar had seen the approaching ships, if exhaustion had not dulled their senses. They rewrote the night in their minds again and again, moving ships on imaginary charts, sending warnings that came on time. In every retelling, the result changed, but the grief remained. The battle had been lost, not only to the enemy, but to a chain of small failures strung together by chance. In the end, the debate became something larger than history. It became a parable about uncertainty, about the choices made in darkness, with incomplete knowledge. Mikawa's caution saved his fleet, but doomed his victory to remain only tactical, never strategic. Turner's confidence before the attack doomed his fleet, but saved the Marines ashore. Each man acted as he thought best. Each paid in his own way. The what-ifs could never bring back the men who sank in Iron Bottom Sound, nor could they change the truth that the ocean, not any admiral, had the final word. In the weeks after the battle, telegrams began arriving across America. They came in brown envelopes, delivered by young men in uniform, each one carrying the same pre-printed line. "The Navy Department regrets to inform you, every family that had a son aboard Vincennes, Quincy, Astoria, or any of the others learned the meaning of silence in a single moment. Mothers dropped to their knees, fathers stood frozen at doorways, children watched in conmotion as the words were read aloud. The war that had seemed far away was suddenly at their table, sitting where someone should have been. In small towns from New England to California, church bells tolled without explanation. Flags lowered to half-staff. Some families refused to believe the letters. They clung to rumors that their sons were alive, that they had been rescued and would come home soon. Others received follow-up messages with a few more details missing in action, presumed lost at sea. No bodies to bury, no graves to visit. The ocean kept them all. In one house in Kansas, a mother pinned her son's photograph to the wall, beside a small map of the Pacific, marking Guadalcanal with a red pin. Every morning she traced the distance between that point and home, whispering prayers to a sea she had never seen. On the other side of the country, in Oregon, a father kept the last letter his boy had written. It spoke of confidence, of adventure, of making a difference. The envelope still smelled faintly of oat. He read it every night until the paper wore thin. Among the survivors, guilt became its own kind of injury. Sailors who had escaped the flames found it harder to survive the memories. They saw faces in their dreams, heard the explosions replay in the hum of ship engines. Some stayed in the Navy, determined to fight until the war was over. Others couldn't bear the sound of water anymore. They drifted home and tried to forget, though forgetting was impossible. The ocean followed them everywhere, in the rhythm of rain, in the creak of floorboards, in every long silence between words. For the Australians, too, the loss of Canberra cut deep. Newspapers called her sacrifice the price of alliance, but the sailors who had known her called it something simple, run fair. They held services on decks of ships still afloat, chaplains reading from small Bibles, while men stared into the waves. Wreaths of flowers floated away, carried by the same current that had carried their friends. The ceremony lasted minutes, but the grief lingered like the smell of smoke after a fire. In the end, Savo Island became more than a battle. It became a wound stitched into the collective memory of two nations. The Navy rebuilt, learned. But the people who had lived through that night carried scars that never showed. For them, the Pacific was not a map or a campaign. It was a cemetery without headstones. Every time they looked at a calm stretch of water, they saw ghosts moving beneath the surface. The war would go on, and victories would follow, but none of them would erase the cost written in the dark water of Iron Bottom Sound. Years later, when the war had ended and the world tried to move on, the sea around Guadalcanal remained the same. Iron Bottom Sound lay calm beneath the tropical sun, its surface shining like glass. Fishermen passed over it quietly, engines throttled low, unwilling to disturb what slept below. The water was clear enough that on some days, when the light was just right, the shadows of ships could be seen beneath the waves, dark outlines, resting in eternal formation. They called it a graveyard, but it felt more like a cathedral, a place where history whispered through the current. One morning, a Navy veteran returned to those waters. He stood on the deck of a small research vessel, gray hair blowing in the wind, the smell of salt thick in the air. He had been a young signalman, aboard one of the destroyers that survived. Now he was back, not as a sailor, but as a mourner. In his hands he held a wreath of white flowers tied with a ribbon that bore only one word: remembrance. As the vessel drifted to a stop, he looked down into the stillness. The sea below was deep blue, endless. Somewhere down there lay his friends, his youth, and a night he had spent his whole life trying to forget. He lowered the wreath into the water. It floated for a moment, spinning gently, before the current began to carry it away. The veteran whispered names under his breath, too many names, and for each one the wind seemed to sigh. Around him, the crew stood silent. No speeches, no orders, no flags, just the sound of the ocean breathing. A few feet away, another man dropped a single rose. It landed softly, its petals spreading like a red star across the surface. Far below, the light dimmed into green shadows, where the wrecks lay quiet and unbroken by time. Fish darted through open hatches, coral grew along the rails, and somewhere in that stillness, helmets rested on the silt beside rusted guns. It was peaceful now, as if the sea had forgiven what humanity never could. The ships no longer bore flags or names, only the memory of those who had served on them. As the veteran turned to leave, he glanced once more at the horizon. Clouds gathered there, pale against the sun, and for a moment, the reflection of the sky on the water looked like fire again. He blinked, and it was gone. The sea returned to its calm, and the only movement was the wreath drifting farther away. "Rest easy," he whispered, not sure if he meant it for the dead or for himself. That night, long after the vessel had returned to port, the water over Iron Bottom Sound was still. The moon rose high, casting a silver path across the waves. Beneath it, unceasing, the shadows of ships stretched out like the memory of a fleet, sailing toward eternity. The ocean kept its secrets, as it always had. But for those who remembered, every ripple carried a story. Savo Island's horror had long since faded into history, yet the silence that followed remained eternal, a reminder that war never truly ends. It only sinks deeper, waiting for someone brave enough to look down and listen.